Thanks, Kevin, and it's good to be back and presenting to you all again. A little bit different topic. Instead of the PPP, which we did a bunch of last year, it's back to more of the sort of normal things that I usually am advising clients about. So we're going to talk about really some experiences and things that we've seen, learned from watching lots of private companies navigate last year and what they're doing now. And the important thing to note here is, our firm only works with private and family-owned companies. So all of my comments are going to be directed at, the experiences there. So to begin with, I think I read this maybe in McKinsey or someone authored an article about this, but 2020, the year of the grind. 2021, the year of transition, as Kevin talked about, the amount of change and everything we're all having to do to try to figure out, as we transition to whatever the new normal is. I've got 2022 as a blank there because I don't think we know that really. We certainly are going to figure it out, I think, as we move along this year to see what that looks like. But the key is, I think we're in a period of time of really substantive change, and it's been sort of hoisted on us very aggressively last year, but there is an opportunity within the change to try to look at parts of your business, and that's what we're gonna talk about. I always like this slide when I think about when businesses hit a rough patch, from The Perfect Storm, which was a movie of a long time ago. Which this is kind of how it felt this time last year. I was on a bunch of webinars with you guys last year, and certainly in April and May. May was better than April. April may have been the toughest month of work I can ever remember. But you oftentimes last year felt like you were, that wave was getting ready to come at you. The reason I like to use this visual to sort of get your mind around it is that while everybody looks at this picture and sees the wave, well, you can also look at the sun, meaning that there is going to be another day here. The sun is shining in this picture. And even though it seems insurmountable, the amount of change and the amount of stuff that's happened to our businesses, it does provide an opportunity, for a future that can be better if you can adapt and, be willing to make the changes that you need to adapt, and not so much from the standpoint of what you were required to do, but also to use it as a learning opportunity to improve the business. And so I remember the last time I got into a lot of projects with companies would have been the financial crisis. And, the theme that we worked under then was, to look for the learning and the opportunity from a crisis as opposed to the negative parts. We all know what the negative parts have been. It's been a tough year, but we're coming out of it. But the key is what we can learn about, our companies and what we do. And one of the things that I think significant events do is that it causes, when you're in a period of time coming up to that where sales are good, business is good, which it was certainly for the 18 months to 2 years prior to last April. I've never seen activity in our businesses in a better situation from an economic standpoint. And what that does, in my experience and working with a lot of companies, is that when business is good, it's easy for all of us, me included, to look at our business and say, man, we're really good. Things are really rolling. We're making a lot of money. Things are all moving in the right direction. And so my observation would be that when you have a very strong economy, strong top line, it masks a lot of problems that are underneath the covers. And, I've got a couple of quotes here that I think are relevant. There's a famous Warren Buffett quote that says, you don't know who's swimming naked until the tide goes out, meaning that when, business isn't as good anymore, you see what really, who really has the strong business model, the strong balance sheet. I have a quote from a client here who I talked to, I love recessions because it forces us to get back to basics and clean up our act. Gives us a good reason to take a fresh look at our business and what we can do better. Again, things that you might not get to when the business is really good and humming. Certainly the challenge for all of us is to pay attention to all of these things when business is good or not good, to look at the execution parts of it. And then lastly, a friend of mine who also does some coaching with me, his name's Chris Mason. This is the advice he gave me last April, which is, in the middle of this being so difficult, his concept was the learning opportunity would be immense, like getting 10 MBAs in 18 months. And I think he was right. the number of situations we've been thrown into to try to help figure things out on our own, from our own standpoint, as well as clients we work with. It's been significant, a learning opportunity. And I think that, I have got 8 concepts here that I'm going to just cover with you. There's probably more, but we have a limited amount of time here, for the program today. But I'm going to go over 8 concepts that I think, sort of looking back at across, hundreds of companies really that I've probably been in contact with last year. What are the things that kind of stand out if I were to, look at it in hindsight and say, gee, what really mattered? And the first one is, the balance sheet matters. So many private owners are so focused on cash flow, the P&L, the sales growth, and all that other kind of stuff. Even when we go through financials at the end of the year, the balance sheet discussion tends to be not the emphasis. But I will tell you that in the past year, the balance sheet, if you didn't think it mattered, I think many companies know that it really does. Because when you're faced with, a slowdown or a stoppage or a large customer that can't pay, or all the number of things that have happened, particularly in Q2 of last year, the strength of your balance sheet and how it's managed really is one of the key tools that help some companies navigate that way better than others with less risk. So things like making sure that you have proper cash levels. And this is a pet peeve of mine, and my clients know that I sound like a broken record. But when we get to the end of the year and we look at results and we say, yeah, we had a great year, we did all this stuff, and we had profits and so forth, I immediately am looking at the balance sheet to see where the cash is at. And if I don't see cash as a result of all this activity on the P&L, I'm going to press people on that to ask where the cash went, because all that activity without creating cash, to me, is an issue. It means that there's an underlying problem somewhere. So within the balance sheet, you want to pay attention there. The other thing is working capital management. Companies that did not manage their turnover of their AR and their inventory and have good credit management practices. Again, when the business gets stressed, if you have a really well-run sort of internal machine in terms of managing AR and inventory, and I'll make a note for those of you that are manufacturers, inventory being the biggest one that most people, in my experience, don't manage as well. They tend to have way too much of it. That exposed a lot of companies when they had too much capital tied up on their balance sheet that wasn't being efficiently used. And lastly, if you already entered this with a lot of excess leverage and your cash flows were very much constrained because you had too many debt service payments. So the structure of your balance sheet matters. And I would, if I were in your shoes, I would suggest, paying more attention to, what that looks like and the balance sheet metrics, not just focusing on growth. Second concept is capital allocation, which is in my world and advising companies, there, when you think about the P&L, there's sort of 2 things going on there. How much money are we earning and making in cash? And step 2 is, what do you do with it after you earn it? Step 2 is capital allocation. Some of the most successful public companies on the planet are run by the best capital allocators, meaning that they are very thoughtful about what they do with their profits. In lots of private companies that are not as sophisticated as having those kinds of discussions, they're less thoughtful about it. They're less thoughtful about the what happens with the profits, and so you have cases where inventory levels go up, or a lot of cash is taken out of the business, leaving it too strained for capital that you might need later, or making investments in fixed assets or new technologies or new projects. So the way that I look at capital allocation, particularly from a reinvestment standpoint, and by the way, each of these concepts I'm going over at a very high level. We could probably have a separate half-hour program on each one of these to go a little bit more in depth as to the kind of things to think about. But the point here is that when you allocate capital, you have to think about what the business needs from a safety standpoint, what's a reasonable amount to leave in, considering new things you've got on the horizon. And when you do make investments, either in an acquisition or some fixed assets or whatever, you should be running models about getting, a return on your capital that's greater than you otherwise would. Otherwise, the project isn't worth pursuing. So we've lots and lots of cases where companies buy new equipment, buy new construction machinery and so forth without having a thorough process in place to evaluate those investments. So capital allocation, if it's not something that's on your mind today, I'd suggest that it should occupy some of your planning discussions about, year end, and of course your planning for the next year. Because again, companies that were thoughtful about it generally had, more resources and had more ease of getting through a difficult rough patch than those that didn't. So last year, people in succession, which is, talk about being with the right partner in MEA to help you with these things. They're expert at these things. But the thing that I'm suggesting here is that if you have not invested properly in thinking about your succession, key roles, and all those things, my gosh, now is a time to learn from that and to try to get that shored up. I can give examples of cases where we had people at clients who were out for prolonged periods of time, people who were sick. And also with something this drastic, not everybody reacts to it the same. And I have several examples of people in key positions. Some people looked at this situation and ran towards the fire when it was burning. We have other people who really backed off, where you were hoping that they were in a significant leadership position where they should be jumping into, the saddle, so to speak, to really help deal with issues, to keep the business taken care of, to keep the people managed, to keep things moving. But the pandemic manifested itself in a lot of ways in terms of people's behavior. And I'm not suggesting that that's an easy thing and it means that they're a bad person, but to me, I have examples of where it told me things about, someone's ability to work under pressure or work under extreme circumstances. The big picture here is that with any of my clients, what I suggest that they do is they look at their key people and their management staff and sort of do a rough evaluation of where they're contributing. And, again, I'm not an HR person like the folks at MEA. I'm sure they've got really specific tools, but I say to myself, everybody better be at a scale of at least 8 out of 10 in terms of their contribution and their capabilities. And if they're not, you got to wonder if you have an issue there. And of course, you got to look at one step below them to see who's coming behind them to make sure that, in all the key positions, there's people being groomed to take over. So I think last year exposed this quite a bit. And we learned a lot about, key leadership roles in companies that needed to be filled. And we're actually working on filling a bunch of those with clients today. So operating leverage is a term that not many of our clients use. I hear it more in the public world, but basically it means the leverage you're getting from your cost structure. And I think most of you a year later probably realize you had more leverage than you thought. I have a company that I'm working with that had customers that were right in the crosshairs of the closures, and their sales dropped very significantly last year for the whole year, almost half. They had to do a massive restructuring, layoff, that whole thing, because they just couldn't sustain themselves. But now business is coming back, and what they're finding is that they're able to service the same level of business, because last year it caused them to be more thoughtful about who did what. When push came to shove, what did they really need people to do, and what were the key things and the not key things, sort of the must-haves and the like-to-haves. And they learned how to do more with less because they were forced to. And now they're out of their sales are recovering, and their operating leverage has increased by like 30%, meaning that they're able to get to the same level of volume on a much lower cost structure. So this goes back to my initial comments along the lines of when business is good and business is flowing, we tend not to look at the execution part of the business because we're too focused on the top line. And and companies tend not to get under the covers and look at their cost structures and leaning out unnecessary things because business is good and you sort of don't have to face those issues, focused on funner things, right? That you can focus on because the company is moving forward. Well, here we're talking about maintaining that focus on making sure that your costs are efficient. Again, I'm not saying to take out all of your costs. I'm saying be focused on taking out waste and making sure your business model is efficient. So IT, Kevin mentioned this, and I commend them for having the cyber webinar. I can tell you that we've had several cases where companies were hacked and shut down. Without having good IT infrastructure, particularly working remote, we had a bunch of cases where people went remote and they didn't have the proper protocols for remote work, and they ended up having security issues, and some of them were significant. So my comment on this slide is that I don't believe we're going to see a year like last year again anytime soon in terms of everything going remote, but there's some hybrid model, as Kevin mentioned, where the new world of work is going to be different with some version of in-office versus remote. And so, we are going to have to be able to function in that world. So to make that efficient, are you using the cloud more to host things versus, at your home server, those kind of things. The other thing that I would add in this slide is that I believe everybody on this call, and I raise our hand also, are going to have to make more significant IT investments in the future to be strategic. And the reason I say that is that if you look at what happened, and the guy in charge of Microsoft, his name's Nadella, very smart guy. His analysis was there was 10 years of technology adoption in 3.5 months, meaning that the technology existed to do all these things remotely and more efficiently, but what usually slows it down is companies take a long time to change people's behavior. Well, that was forced upon us, and it's not going back. Now, it doesn't mean it's going to be at the same level of remote work and using all these other tools, but we're not going to retreat. And so spending on IT to get more efficient, to get better tools, and I think it's going to be an issue for your employees in terms of retention. If you're a company that has good technology tools that makes it easy for people to work versus another employer who's clunky and 5 years behind, you're probably going to lose workers because of that. Because the new world we're in, we're much more reliant on the technology tools. So our view at Chrysler Miller is technology spend is a strategic issue at this point. And I suggest you really look at what your plans are there. Getting down to the end of my comments here, but this is sort of a common issue, but I think last year, and I think now especially, your strategy and business model, it's a good time to focus on thinking through what that really means, what conveys your competitive advantage. More importantly, and I would say many of the people on this call are experiencing either shortages in materials, shortages of people to get the work done, so that when you have constraints on your business and they are prolonged, at some point you got to look at where you're going to allocate your resources to, and you probably need to get rid of some bad customers. This is a good practice in my view to do annually anyway, and evaluate what is an A customer for my business, who are we after, what markets do we serve, what are we great at, where do we add the most value. So a very focused strategy to get clear about that. The most profitable companies I work with are absolutely crystal clear on what markets they serve, what their customers look like, what margins they require. And if somebody doesn't fit that model, they say no to their business. Well, I think you're probably at a point now where there's so many constraints that you're going to need to think about that. So it's a good time to revisit your strategy and your business model and where your focus lies, because among choices, that's what strategy is. It's allocating resources among a vast number of choices, and putting it towards the most productive and the most value creating activities. So a lot of people think that their strategy is that business plan that gets put together once a year. It says what we're going to do. That's really not what strategy is. Do a lot of strategy work with companies, and it comes down to figuring out how to allocate resources among competing choices in a good fashion. So definitely something that manifested itself last year. Concentration and constraint risks is something that usually a concentration risk would always come up for those of you that had any kind of a business valuation. If you had a concentration on a customer greater than X, it would affect the valuation. A lot of people sort of yawn at that one, but last year it really mattered. And so I would suggest, looking at your customers, your markets, and your supply chain to think about where you have concentrations, to try to include part of your planning as to how you're going to minimize those risks. A constraint risk is something I've also seen, and we've learned this the hard way at our own business, where we that would be a constraint where a single element of a process can shut down your operation for a day. Could be a person, a vendor, a machine. And so this isn't like a concentration of customer demand. This is a process that's critical to the operation of your business that could shut it down. An example would be where you have internet service. This is an example that we had to deal with. We had internet service into our building. We had a large company supplier of that. It's been fine forever, and a part broke. And they couldn't get their hands on a replacement part. We don't know why, but our internet service for an accounting firm where you've got 200 workers who need access to resources and to share information, Microsoft Teams and so forth, working remotely, that was a big deal, and that caused a disruption for us for a few days. And so we've had to shore that up, which we've done, but that's an example. So if you're interested in an article on that, I wrote an article about it about a month ago. If anybody wants a copy of it, my email's attached here. Just send me a note and I'll send you a copy of how to locate the constraint risks in your processes. And my last slide before I close here is just about innovation and change. I mean, I have to tell you, one of the reasons I love doing what I do is working with private owners and family-owned companies. I appreciate people who have their own capital at risk, that take risk, employ people, create value for their customers. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing. And I have to say, I've seen so much innovation and change take place last year in terms of people trying to figure out how to adapt. It was unbelievable to see some of the things that went on. My message here is, sort of goes back to my slide, we're in this year of transition, and I can tell you, we're looking at lots of things that we need to adapt and change as things open back up, as people become feeling more safe. And we're going to need to adapt a lot of our processes, a lot of our procedures, the way we do things, to be able to, work within a situation where there's a lot of change going on, a lot of disruption still. And we're trying to figure out what this looks like on the other side. But I have to tell you, we don't have an answer. I don't think anyone does. One thing I can tell you is that I expect that we'll make changes, and then next year, we may change our mind on some things rather short term as we see things happening, because the pace of change is so rapid. And so for those of you who are not open-minded to adapting your business model, your structure, and all those other things that are so critical to do what you do, this is a time more than ever to confront change, to confront innovation, make it part of your dialogue at every management staff meeting about what it is that is coming at you and how adaptive you're going to be. It's try to capture that magic of what you had to do last year when you were in the midst of the pandemic and you were forced to do things. See what you can do to try to pull that forward and make it part of your normal discussion and part of your normal culture in an environment that we're in that's going to continue to change drastically. That's the end of my slides, Kevin. As I said, if anybody has any questions, my email's here. I think Kevin's going to distribute the slides. And if you'd like that article, just send me a note.
Mario, thank you very much. That was great. And I was writing notes as you went along, and you captured on that last slide. I think everybody that made it through last year said, the word I kept hearing was we pivoted really well, which kind of was that message of things are going along and we were able to adapt. And I think, like you said, when I look forward, everything is now fluid. And the more you understand how to still run a business, but figure out how to keep looking ahead and not waiting for that massive disruption, because everybody had to redo something. And I think that's really the task for leadership teams, is to say, let's, can we make change normal? And again, it's not just change. It's like, how do you do it? Do you do prototype? Do you trial? Do you flush it out? But I mean, it feels that, we're all talking about the next normal right now, but I think in my head, it's like, it's the next normal for the next 6 months. And after that, there's what's next after that and after that. And it's that, I think I've said this before, I grew up in a culture where I worked before this, it was a change or die. That was our mindset. And that's pretty extreme. You don't have to be quite there, but I think if you don't continue to look and do the what ifs and figure out what could happen, you're going to get, the risk is getting caught flat-footed. But great session. Thank you very much. We always love to have you, Mario, and we will send out his slides after this. All right, with that, let me turn it over to Sienna and Jane.